morning. Again, my name is Cathy. I'm one of the pastors here, and I was just thinking, and I shared with the first service how thankful I am for God's faithfulness. My husband and son and I went upstate yesterday, and we got 7 inches of snow. And we're kind of snowed in, and we were supposed to come back last night, but ended up coming in early this morning, and I got here, and there was no snow on the ground. Did you guys have snow? You did? Well, where did it go? At any rate, I am thankful for God's faithfulness to bring us back this morning so I could be here with you all today, and I didn't have to call Drew and say, oh no. But if you've been here with us for the last couple weeks, you may remember we are in a series of the book of Ruth, and I'm excited to bring some insights from chapter 3 today in the book of Ruth. And if you haven't been with us for the last couple weeks, I want to give you a little bit of speedy context to bring you up to speed so you know where we're going today and where we've been in chapters 1 and 2. So in chapter 1, you may remember there was a man named Elimelech, and he had a wife named Naomi. They had 2 sons, and the sons had 2 wives, Naomi and Elimelech's daughter-in-laws. And we know that from chapter 1, Elimelech now has died, and the sons have died. And so Naomi is unfortunately left on her own with her daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, and we read in chapter 1 that Naomi basically lets them off the hook, tells them, hey, you don't have to go. I'm going to go to Bethlehem. You don't have to go with me. It's okay if you want to go out and start your own life. And we know that Orpah actually decides to say goodbye and go off on her own, but Ruth stays with Naomi. And Ruth goes on to Bethlehem with Naomi, not really knowing what's going to happen, what they're going to see when they get there, but the 2 of them go on. Then in chapter 2, we read that Ruth actually, based on Naomi's advice, because they were concerned, obviously Naomi was concerned about how they would live, how they would be provided for. Back in these times, it was quite a patriarchal society, and so Naomi instructs Ruth to go to this wealthy relative named Boaz, and that Boaz would eventually let her work in his field. We know that he let her glean, take food home for she and Naomi. And one of the things I loved about last week's message that Drew highlighted was that it was through Ruth's quiet faithfulness that it led her to being seen by Boaz, seen by God, and that even when we think in turn we are not seen, as perhaps maybe Ruth thought as well, that God sees us, and that it is through that quiet faithfulness that we receive reward and blessing. And so this brings us up to chapter 3, and I love this chapter. I got to admit, though, as I was poring over it this last month, I realized it's actually kind of risky. It's a lot risky, actually, in terms of what Ruth is being asked to do, and potentially kind of dangerous as well. And so even though what I love about this, God is not mentioned in this chapter, or really in Ruth at all, there are so many godly themes that I think are demonstrated throughout this book. And so this morning, I want us to take a look at one sort of theme. I want us to highlight one sort of topic of the Christian life that I believe can be often overlooked or even taken for granted for in some cases. And I believe that this, in addition to Ruth's quiet faithfulness, we see this type of trait in her life that leads to her blessing through Boaz by God. And so let's pick it up in chapter 1. We know Naomi is instructing Ruth here. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." And again, we see this as we did in chapter 2. We see this need for Naomi to find protection, to be cared for Ruth to be cared for, provided for. That's a concern that she has. And so now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. And so basically we have Naomi, telling Ruth, get gussied up. Do we use the word gussied anymore? I'm going to use the word gussy. I like that word, gussy. But get gussied up. Put on your finest. Put on your finest perfume. Get your finest clothes on. Look your best, she's telling Ruth. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. And I don't know about you, but after I read that verse, he will tell you what to do, I started thinking, if I had been Ruth, I'm not sure I would have done that, right? Like, it's almost like, in chapter 2, we had this, Naomi instructing Ruth, go to this very public place, right? It's a field where other women are working, and presumably there were men there as well. And we know that Naomi instructs Ruth to go there and to seek out Boaz. Boaz finds her. That's kind of one thing, to go to public place, seek out this wealthy relative. But it's a whole other thing Naomi is now asking her to do, to go to this private place, to a man she barely knows, who, though he's a relative, she doesn't know him very well, and he will tell you what to do. It's a little risky. It would be like somebody, I was thinking, asking me, if I needed help with something, or I needed a resource. Somebody tells me, go down to a very quiet street in Soho at 12 o'clock at night and meet this man, and he will tell you what to do. I don't think I'd do that. I don't know about you, but I don't think I would be willing to do that. What is Ruth getting into here, right? And what's so interesting, if we look on at verse 3, look at how Ruth obeys. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. Whatever you say. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. Everything, without question. I will do what you say. And so in my mind, this is radical obedience. If you were here this summer, perhaps you heard me teach a little bit on this idea of radical obedience. This is the epitome. This is the epitome of radical obedience. Going to this very private, kind of risky kind of situation. And so we pick it up in verse 7. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovering his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." A guardian redeemer. And Drew touched on this a bit last week, this idea of a guardian redeemer. We know that clearly Naomi had in mind that Boaz would probably be this guardian redeemer. And so I started to do a little research on thinking about what is a guardian redeemer? Like back in this time frame, what did a guardian redeemer do? And I put up a couple things just so you can track along with me in terms of what a guardian redeemer would physically do in this time period. One, they might be an influential close relative who an extended family could turn to for help. This is certainly a scenario we're seeing here play out with Boaz. They're responsible for buying back family land in a crisis. I was thinking about, back in that time, there were farmers, right? There was land was very important. And I was thinking, nowadays what we might look at that as if, I spent some time in the Midwest. Some of you know I went to high school and college there in Missouri, and there were a lot of farms. And sometimes I remember I think it was the 90s, the early to mid 90s, farmers would oftentimes be in jeopardy of losing their land. And the land may have been in their home and their family for generations and generations. And so often what would happen is that they would seek out an influential relative to help them to purchase the land back. So they might be responsible for buying back land, buying back enslaved relatives, providing an heir for a dead relative, I think we certainly see this here in this scenario. As we know, Elimelech has passed. And there needs to be an heir. There needs to be someone who can redeem Naomi and Ruth. And then lastly, I circled this one because I think this is one of the ones that stood out to me the most. But a guardian redeemer would care for relatives going through difficult circumstances. So we see Boaz here in chapter 2 has already met their physical need. He's provided food, let Ruth work in the field. And now Ruth is asking for more, to redeem them through this difficult circumstance that they find themselves in. And so we pick it up in verse 10 where Boaz says, "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." And we've seen this, as we've seen through the first 2 chapters, this character of Ruth sort of being demonstrated in her posture towards Naomi to follow Naomi sort of blindly, not knowing what she was walking into. This kindness that she has shown, this noble character. Boaz goes on to say, "Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." And what really struck me about this specific passage, especially as we look at verse 12, that there was in fact another relative. There was another relative that was closer in the, family line order to Elimelech that could have served as Ruth's guardian redeemer. But Boaz, in an act of loving kindness, says, it's okay. If he doesn't want to do it, I'll do it. He doesn't have to do it, right? It's not his obligation. But he says, I'll do it. And so it got me to thinking, in my own life, and perhaps maybe in your own life, you can sit here this morning and think, have you ever had an experience where someone did something for you when they didn't have to, when they weren't obligated to? And maybe that's something that they did or said to you cost them something. We know certainly here that if Boaz takes on this role as guardian redeemer, it's going to cost him something, isn't it? But I wondered if you have ever thought about that. Has anyone ever done something for you where it cost them something, even when they didn't have to? And then also another characteristic of this type of kindness is that there's no other motive but to bless the person. There's no other motive to bless the person. And when we talk about this type of kindness in Scripture, there's a Hebrew word for that, and it's called chesed, and it means loving kindness. And this chesed we see all throughout the Old Testament as it describes God and God's loving kindness towards his people, his loving kindness to the whole earth, really. And so I was thinking about this, this idea of this true chesed, right? So some of the aspects of this are that, the person doesn't have to do it. There's no obligation or no responsibility to do it. But they do it with no motive, but just to bless another person. And I was thinking about an example. There are many examples I can think of over my life where people have demonstrated this type of chesed, this loving kindness. But I was remembering specifically when my family and I lived in Georgia for about 10 years, there was this Starbucks that had a drive-through, and it was the one closest to our farm. It was just a couple minutes away, and unfortunately, I used to like to frequent there quite often, several times a week. And so I would go through the drive-through, and I'd order my coffee, and if you've been through the drive, how many of you drive here? Anybody drive? Some of you drive. So hopefully some of you have had the opportunity to go through a drive-through Starbucks. It's kind of nice. And you pull out your app, and you pull up to the window, and I would order my coffee, and I'd hold the app out, shove it in their face so they could reach it, and the person would say, oh, it's covered. Don't worry about it. It's been paid for. Really? Who paid for it? What do you mean it's covered? And they say, oh, the person in front of you. They already paid for your order. The first time this happened to me, I was blown away. I was like, why would somebody do that, right? Why would somebody pay for my order? First of all, they don't even know how much my order was. What if I'd ordered like 6 Starbucks sandwiches and like 7 coffees, right? But they're like, no, it's taken care of. Don't worry about it. Another time in my life where my family and I experienced this type of loving kindness with no ulterior motive, but just to bless us is, some of you know this story, some of you don't. When my family and I moved our son of 12 years old back to New York a couple years ago, about 6 months into his start of middle school, there was a very traumatic accident that happened at his school involving him. And a piano had actually fallen on top of him, 500-pound piano. And I'll never forget that day because as parents, it was horrible, to say the least. And we rushed to the hospital. He was taken to the ER. It took them about 8 hours just to rule out all the different things that could have gone wrong. You know, he could have been paralyzed. His ribs could have been cracked. His lungs could have been punctured. Thankfully, none of those things happened. But they did discover some fractures in his lower spine. And so I remember that night. It was a Monday night. And I remember about maybe 9 o'clock in the evening, we finally got up to a room. They admitted him into a room. And about a half hour later, one of his teachers from the school showed up with another pastor friend of his who I'd never met before. And they said, hey, we're here. We want to try and encourage Thomas, and we want to pray for him. And is that okay? And I'm like, yeah, that's okay. That's more than okay. And so they spent about an hour with him just trying to kind of cheer him up and make him laugh. And they laid hands on him and prayed for his healing. I mean, those prayers are answered. He is fully healthy, and it's like nothing ever happened today. But they did that not out of obligation, but out of that hesed, out of loving kindness to bless our family, to bless my son. And I'll never forget it. I'll never forget it. And so I just wonder this morning, does that bring to mind any situations you've been in where maybe God has spoken through another person, his loving kindness to you? If we take a look at what Colossians 3:12 says, it encourages us, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And I want to submit to you this morning, as I am convicted of this myself, that the mark of a Christian life is loving kindness. It is this chesed, that loving kindness that has first been poured out on us through God, that we then have the opportunity to pour out to others. And this is what should mark us as Christ followers. And I believe that it is this loving kindness, in addition to the quiet faithfulness that we talked about last week, that actually leads to greater blessing in our lives. And we see this said all throughout the book of Ruth. We saw in chapter 1, right? Ruth goes with Naomi. Chesed. She loves her in kindness and goes with her, even though she has no idea what's ahead of her. In chapter 2, we see how Boaz absolutely demonstrates chesed, loving kindness to Ruth, and then also, therefore, to Naomi by allowing her to work in his field, to gather food, providing water. And we also know that in chapter 2, Boaz says, I will protect you as well. I will make sure that no harm comes to you while you're here. He didn't have to do any of that, did he? And in the same way, I just think about how God is constantly showing us his loving kindness, loving, caring for us, redeeming our lives, even when we're not faithful. When we don't have the radical obedience like Ruth did, right? I can think of many times in my life when God has continued to show his loving kindness to me, even when I've been, frankly, a brat and not been faithful and not been obedient. Some of you know my story of outside of college, entering into an abusive marriage. I took that step, even though there were red flags. And I think about how God, in his loving kindness, redeemed me from that situation, gave me a second chance, gave me a wonderful husband now of 21 years and a beautiful son. I also think about the times in my life, specifically the time when I first left New York after having been in full-time ministry for a little while and experiencing some church pain. And I said, God, I don't want to ever do that again. I don't want to be in full-time ministry anymore if that's what that's all about. And so we went to Georgia, and I in God's loving kindness, he allowed me to go and start my own business, right? I kind of did my own thing. And yet, as I stand here today, I think about how God redeemed those 10 years. How I ended up running a business that I thought was going to be all about dogs, but ended up being all about teaching people. And for 10 years, God allowed me to hone my teaching skills, my leadership skills, so that I could be up here today with you all. He redeemed those 10 years, even when I wasn't faithful. And you see, the greatest act of loving kindness that God has ever demonstrated to us and to the world is by sending his son Jesus to die on a cross for us. Jesus is our guardian redeemer, just like Boaz was Ruth's guardian redeemer. And it is our responsibility as Christ's followers, when we have that redemption, when we have that loving kindness, we possess it, is to pass it on to others, to not keep it to ourselves, but to share it. I love what Richard Rohr says. Compassion includes a willingness to identify so fully with someone that you would be willing to carry a little of their suffering. It is a quality that increases with practice and use. If you don't choose daily and deliberately to practice loving kindness, it is unlikely that a year from now you will be any more loving. That hits me. And I think, Lord, am I practicing that kindness daily? Am I being intentional about giving away the loving kindness that I myself have been given? And, he talks about, are we willing to carry a little bit of the suffering? And I think, wow, Jesus carried all of my suffering. And not only all of my suffering, but all of your suffering. All of our sin, not just some of it. And in fact, carried it for the whole world, that the whole world and all of mankind could experience redemption. It's the greatest act of chesed ever known. And this is what marked Jesus and his followers, is this loving kindness, and that same loving kindness should mark us. This type of loving kindness also is not a kind that is self-seeking. There's no agenda. And maybe as a New Yorker, you're here. I know I've lived in New York on and off over the last 20 plus years. And I know that sometimes it's easy as we go from point A to point B in the city to not experience chesed, right? I've had my fair share, and maybe you have too, of being on the subway and perhaps people being, in fact, the opposite of loving kindness, but to be unkind. And in those moments, it costs me something to, in fact, be loving to them instead of what I would like to do, which is sometimes punch people in the face, but can't do that. And perhaps you've experienced that too. Perhaps you are sitting here today and maybe you're feeling the weight of not experiencing that chesed in New York. And I just want to encourage you that there is a God who wants to pour out his loving kindness on you, who has poured out his loving kindness. And I think about When I first entered into a relationship with Jesus, back in my teenage years, I also think about this type of loving kindness, a relationship with our guardian redeemer. I think about how I was before that loving kindness entered my life, and I think about how I am now, and I think about how Jesus transformed my life. And perhaps you're here today too, and you entered into a relationship with Jesus at some point in time, and you too remember what it was like before Jesus and now after Jesus. It's life transforming. And I think that same type of life transformation that we experience through Jesus, through having a relationship with Jesus, is also the same type of hesed, loving kindness, that when we pour it out on others, guess what? It's life-changing to them. And it's contagious. When we are kind to others, it is contagious. So last Saturday, Drew and myself and a couple of our pastors from the Hope churches were actually out at a summit conference with a family of churches down in Atlanta. And if we have that picture slide, I'd love to throw it up. On Saturday, so I'm going to read this out to you because it's very fuzzy. My picture taking on my phone is not too great. But on Saturday, went to the conference, had lunch there, and I realized before the afternoon session started, I was like, I need to run to the restroom. So I go find the facility restroom, and I walk in, don't look at anything else, just find a stall, go in, go to the restroom. I come out, and I'm washing my hands, and this is what I see on the mirror. You can see on the mirror of the sink, it says, "Hey, beautiful, you got this. Hey, beautiful, you got this." I'm like washing my hands and I'm reading this. I'm like, wow, that's kind of cool. I kind of feel like $1 million right now. Like, hey, I got this. And then I go to dry my hands, and I go over to the dryer, and I'm drying my hands, and I look over, and there's this full-length mirror right there, and I see, again, like what looks like writing in lipstick on the bottom. And it says, "You are loved. You are loved." And it just struck me in that moment. First of all, I was thinking, who thought of this? Like, this was a really great idea, just to encourage every woman that walked into that bathroom. And there were hundreds of people at this conference. And every woman who walked into this restroom, maybe they were feeling down. Maybe they were weary. But they walked in, received those words, and I know for me, I was changed. I walked out, I was like feeling like $1 million, like, hey, beautiful, you got this. You are loved. So the kindness, we have these beautiful opportunities to demonstrate the love of God, his loving kindness to others, and it is life-changing. Ephesians 4:32, look at what it says. Be kind and compassionate to one another. And so I just want to remind us this morning that as Christ followers, as people who have entered into a relationship with Jesus, that we have this immense opportunity to demonstrate the loving kindness, the hesed, that we have received through our guardian redeemer, Jesus, to the world. And he says, don't keep it. We're instructed, be kind and compassionate. Clothe yourself with kindness. And as Richard Rohr said, as we saw in that quote, I'm reminded myself as I was reading this chapter over and over that, this kindness that we saw poured out in multiple relationships, in the relationship with Naomi and Ruth and Ruth and Boaz, and it was intentional. It was intentional. And I know I'm challenged as I think about, what Rohr says is to be deliberate and daily. Be intentional with the kindness that we show others. And it challenges me, and hopefully it challenges you this morning.